Russian President Vladimir Putin has been holding talks in St Petersburg with a delegation from 7 African nations who've called for peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. Mr Putin told the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and his colleagues that improving ties with African countries was a priority. He praised what he called their balanced position on the war. Many African countries have been hit by the cut in exports of grain and fertiliser as a result of the Russian invasion. In his opening remarks, Mr Ramaphosa said he hoped the talks could lead to the end of the Ukrainian conflict.
We are here to communicate a very clear message that we would like this war to be ended. We say so because this war is having a negative impact on the African continent and indeed on many other countries around the world.
Well, President Putin said the food crisis has been caused by the actions of Western countries, not by what Russia describes as its special military operation in Ukraine.
We understand that, in spite of everything, in spite of all the issues connected to the conflict on Ukrainian territory and the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, developing countries, including countries in Africa that are in need of food, should not suffer. We do not believe that Ukrainian grain supplies on the world market solve the problems of hunger.
And for more on this, I spoke earlier to our correspondent in Kyiv, Miney Jones.
Fair to say that they haven't changed the dial on the situation in Ukraine, but they will say they will have been happy to have put to both the Ukrainian and Russian leaders, as well as the rest of the world, one of their key aims, which is to remind the world that this conflict is having an impact on Africa because the continent relies so heavily on food imports from both those countries, and to put forward what they think is a way to reach peace, and that's through negotiation and that's through diplomacy. Now, the key sticking point with that is that Ukraine has said that it can't negotiate with Russia as long as it occupies some of its territory, and Russia has replied that it won't negotiate with Ukraine unless Ukraine recognizes what it describes as new territorial realities. So that's the stalemate between both countries. Clearly, this African delegation hasn't managed to bring both sides together, but they will have been glad to put the issue of grain shortages on the global agenda.
President Zelensky didn't want these African leaders to go to Russia. There have been other attempts to try and broker a deal between Ukraine and Russia. Turkey's been seen as a peacemaker in the past. People have even talked about India. Is there any country that Ukraine sees from where you are could be more useful in trying to bring this conflict to an end?
I think Ukraine at the moment, the key thing it wants from its international allies, and this is something Mr Zelensky said during the press conference he held with these African leaders when they were here on Friday, the key thing he wants is for the international community and any international partner that wants to convince him to negotiate to talk about freezing Russia diplomatically out. He thinks that this is the only way the world can send a message to the Russian people that it stands with Ukraine, and the reason why they're isolated on the global stage is because of their leader. Short of that, he's asking for more military support from NATO partners, many of whom have pledged more ammunition, more air defense systems, more training in the last week. A lot of NATO allies rallying around Ukraine's ongoing counteroffensive against Russia. At the moment, details are thin on the ground as to how that's progressing, but the Ukrainians say they are making tactical gains, particularly in the regions of Donetsk and Zaporizhia. The Russians say that the Ukrainians haven't had any success in this counteroffensive so far, that they're increasingly relying on donations from NATO, that their own personal stocks are depleted.